In the previous tutorials in this set, we've been exploring how we might actually apply a color palette to an image. I've been doing that thus far with blend if, looking at particular colors and taking a look at where they blend, the blend if features, as well as using that color palette within a gradient map and taking a look at how that gradient map might play out. In this video, I'd like to explore color grading with our color palette by manipulating the curves. And this will be a little bit more subtle, but often good for integrating images together. I'm going to work with the color image that's here and then simply make some curves adjustment to that image. So I'm going to go to my adjustments and choose curves for this. Now there's a few different ways we might explore this, but before we get going, I want to make sure I'm not on the mask of the curves, but actually on the curves themselves. Sometimes you have the mask selected and I want to be kind of on the curves. And then what I'm going to do is use these different eyedroppers to sample the white point, the gray point, and the black point of our images. So I'm going to first double click on the white point here and then use the colors from our color palette. So I'm going to choose the lightest color in this case and click OK. And then I'm going to then not make it a default here, but apply that back to some of the lightest colors within my image. And so I can see I've got some real lights in the shirt, the sweatshirt that's here. So I'm going to go ahead and apply those in this case. And it's going to sort of yellow that up just a little bit based on our color here. Then I'm going to go to the midtones, double click on that, select maybe my midtone from the color palette that I was working with, and then I'm going to apply that back to the midtones in the image. And I think maybe the jeans kind of represent more of a midtone, so I'm going to go ahead and sample those, and it will adjust accordingly here. And then lastly, I'm going to go to the black point and double click to sample the darkest color in our palette from our other image, and I'll go ahead and not make that a default, but then apply it to the darkest areas in my photo, which I think is kind of this side. There's some shadow and dark hair there. That's pretty dark in the image. And now we've readjusted this with some of the curves. You can see the difference, how our color palette is starting to be applied back. You might call this color grading, where we're taking some of the color from one image really and using that to influence the color in another image. There's an alternative workflow to this that gives you a little bit different results, and sometimes I like one versus the other better. And so I'm going to take this curves off and do that again through a different way of doing curves adjustment. And this time with the curves, again, I want not to be on the mask part, but on the curves part. And I'm going to adjust this by clicking on the hamburger menu and choose to do these auto options that are available. Under the auto options, one of the options is to find the light and dark colors within the image and then sort of remap them. So I'm going to target those shadows, midtones, and highlights. And so in the shadows, I'm going to go ahead and select my darkest colors and click OK. In the midtones, I'm going to select those midtone colors and click OK. And in the highlights, I'm going to select the light colors from my palette and click OK. And then I'll click OK overall. And so I'm not making that a default. I'll say no. And you can see that this curves adjustment is pushing the image as well a little bit more to our color palette space, really just the the highlight, the midtone, and the dark of our color palette. And then that's a little different than the other one that was here. So this one and this one are just a little different. You can see that this is a little washed out, has a little bit less contrast, and that's partly because we're remapping the highlights to kind of a lighter yellow, which isn't quite white, the darks to this sort of dark brown, which isn't quite black, and so we're losing a little contrast. We could bring some of that back while keeping our color space by simply adding some contrast through, for example, levels adjustment. If I bring the levels adjustment out, I can see I don't have any true darks there, and I could bring this out and add a little bit of contrast back into that, still sort of keeping our colors, and I might do that on the low end as well, or on the high end with the sort of highlights that's there, and adding that contrast back. So that levels will bring back some of the contrast that might be a part of our image, but definitely sort of change the color space overall. That was more blue and now kind of has more colors that were reflecting the colors that were in our scene originally and that color sort of palette from the scene. Indeed, what I could do is take some of these things together. So let's say I'm just going to make a duplicate of the background and make like a group out of these. I'm going to just sort of convert these into a new group. I could do that with Control G or hitting the folder group icon as well. And then I'm going to duplicate that group. I'll say duplicate group. And what we'll do is we'll bring that over into this other photo just to explore this. So there's that group on top of the other photo. I'm going to just turn all the rest of this off. And what I'm going to do in this group is grab a selection and just pull the woman from her background. And so I'll do that by simply hitting select subject. And really I should sort of dial that in. The hair is not going to be perfect, but I'll just mask her from the background and we can kind of see the color space matching potentially the color space in this image just a little bit better. If I take those curves adjustment off, this is how she would have been in that space. And if I bring the curves kind of back, and I need that to apply just to the woman and not dropping all the way to the other parts of the image. So I'm going to make a clipping mask for that. And we can make sure that these adjustments only apply to her and not all the way down. But we can kind of see the color space that was a little bluer here, maybe shift a little bit more to be more appropriate within that scene. So this is a technique you might use in order to make photos feel like they're a little bit more natural within their environments by pulling colors from one image and kind of applying them back. And I'm using curves adjustments to do that, but sort of applying that color palette back into your photo. If we're in video, we might call this color grading as well. So it's a useful technique to explore when exploring working with applying your color palettes. Now, while this has helped match the colors between these, in part because they're starting to share some colors, I could probably push this even further. Sometimes in order to unite colors together, I'll create a new layer on top of everything and I'll select a color. It could be from the scene itself or it could be really any color. If I knew that I wanted sort of a warmer color scene, maybe I'll go ahead and choose some of these oranges that are there. And what I might do is fill that in. I could have used a solid color fill as well, and then apply that back to the scene. So I could apply it with some overlay or soft light, for example, back to the scene. This will up the contrast a little bit, and then I'll take the opacity of that down. But what these are now doing is sharing 20% of that orange. And so both the and that will sometimes help unite the whole thing a little bit, is that both the background and the foreground are sharing that orange. And so one of the last things I'll show you is how you could actually sometimes apply that in a different way through saving out your colors. So I'm going to go back to this other photo where I had created this gradient map as an example. And it's possible to save out your color space here into a LUT file, what's called a color lookup table file. So I'm going to go under File, Export, and export this color lookup table. And I can sort of give that a description, sort of, this is a sort of yellow, green, blue kind of style here. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK and then export this out. So I'll put this into some samples that are there and I'll call it sort of beachy or whatever. That's where I was pulling that. I've now saved that color table. And then what I could do is come back into this scene and I'm going to apply that. And so I could then apply that through adjustments with color lookup. So I'm going to go ahead and choose color lookup as an adjustment. I'll pull that maybe out of the group for now. Oops, I don't need this anymore. Let me pull that up out of the group. There it is. And under the color lookup, there's different sort of color spaces. And so it's interesting to apply some of these. You can take a look at what they look like. Like if I wanted a crisp, warm look, you'll see that it's kind of applying these different color spaces. There's a winter look to the different scenes. So I can get this sort of bleached out look. And so there's a lot of these that are in here. Here's a sunset, late sunset look that has these purple and oranges that are part of them. And that's kind of uniting the space. And certainly what I could do is take the opacity of that down so that it's not so dramatic, but it's still helping to unite the color space overall. But I can load in my own versions of these. So if I load the LUT file, I can go and find where that was. So I'm going to browse out for it. And here's that sort of beachy cube file. This is the one I want. I'll hit load and it will load that in. Basically, it's applying that sort of gradient mask now kind of across my scene. It's applying that sort of color profile over the whole thing. Now, I could then bring this back to make it more subtle by taking the opacity down, so some of the colors that were underneath are also coming through, or by applying a blend mode, such as like a soft light overlay. And you can see that that color space is really shifting here, but also uniting the foreground and background together as that happens. And so it's kind of interesting to me to sort of play with these color palettes, see how we might unite photos, what we might do with the palettes, and hopefully you've enjoyed the ride. I want to actually make this a little bit more subtle, like maybe only 40%, but I'm taking some of those colors and kind of applying them now. And without these changes, the image in the scene just didn't fit with the lighting exactly as well and the colors within the scene. By doing some of these techniques to unite them, they sort of fit together and look like it might have been shot within that same environment and with that same color and light. So those are a few things to try in your own projects.